Over the last few months, I have had numerous requests here, and then people getting this on tape from those of more recent attendance to these meetings and showing to the tapings, asking me specifically to make further elaboration on my terms of C and D and E force that periodically spring up in my comments. And I decided to do so, but since this is not a linear progression, and over the last months and years and even days, it does not in some reasonable, predictable, backup fashion without absolutely running your tires, there is no way that I'm going to attempt to profitably replow and to bring you people, quote, up to date on these terms or any other terms. And even first, but I am going to say something so it will not seem strange, because there's always something new to be said about some stuff. But first off, let me note the terms that the people are asking about. Some of you, of course, have heard it many times, and some of you have only heard me mention it in passing, that I referred to C, three forces, C, D, and E force. What to begin with. Of course, I didn't make up the word C, D, and E, and I didn't make up the word force, but in a sense I made them up. And in a sense they're irrelevant, because there is no such thing as C force and D force and E force. There is a reality behind the terms. There is an operational, quite valid reality behind the terms, behind the maps, the verbal kind of maps, but once you can see it in a more complex fashion, when it's brought from a more complex world. The truth is, the reality behind it is too subtle and really too foreign to be bound by earthward limits. Now, I'm saying all this as a kind of non-directional caveat that there really is no such thing as a C force. There is no such thing as a force of any description on this planet. There is that which is visible, and by that I mean the human nervous system through one means or another can measure it. It may not be within the electromagnetic field that will actually hit the apple part of the eye that you may be able to see, but through indirect technological means, which is just an extension of the human intellect, they can apparently measure things that are not seen, not heard. But there is no force. They can call it gravity. I can call it a C force, not that they're in any way synonymous, but there is no, quote, gravitational force. Even life is laying out the information in physics, which this is not a course in physics whatsoever, but it's even permeating into the intellect of those generally wired up to be scientists, specifically physicists. They don't specify it in this particular way, but it's beginning to seep in to general awareness that there is something funny about absolutely accepting any prior definition of a law of physics as being a law. It's sort of an offshoot, I guess they would say, of the heyday intro of quantum mechanics. But beyond all that, even what I mean by it, there is no C force, there is no D force, because there is no force. Now, the only reason I make up the terms, even though they have validity, if you can begin to think about them yourself, use your own intellectual measurements to do it yourself in a more enriched way that's beyond the terms. The reason I make them up is, although they do have some operational pertinence here, the point is I'm bringing them from another place. They're not part of our language. C, D, and E and the word force is part of your language, part of the earth language, but the reality behind it, if I told you that I knew some other words for it that were valid somewhere else, if I said the words, they'd just be hogwash. Not specifically hogwash, that's not the word. It would be abracadabra. It would be falderoy. It would be mishmash. But the word would mean nothing. I could say, well, I made up this word. Same way as I made up metavesco. I could say, well, here's the word, and it represents C-force. And I could talk a long time about what, from ordinary views, you would think C-force is, and that's all right. Forget C-force, or forget it. One time I called it constructive force. Forget all that, because that's not what it is. It's actually, and then I said this word that you'd never heard. And I said, by the way, I didn't make this word up. On another place, this is actually what they call C-force. I could say that, and so what? Are you going to be impressed? I might as well have made it up. But I did have to make up C-force, D-force, and E-force because of the fact the reality behind it is not expressed verbally on this planet. It is not. Now, it has pertinence. I can draw parallels, or it would not have made as much sense as it does, or has to some of you already. There is a parallel reality of it. There is a pertinence thereof here. But it comes from a different environment. And it comes, what words there are for it, it comes from another language, and so it would be impertinent, it would be irrelevant, it would be a waste of time for me to use those words, and so I make up. In this case, instead of making up one that even sounds strange, I just called it C-force or D-force or E-force. Those of you around here a while, you know that when I first started trying to describe and point this, or point your attention toward what I was attempting to describe, I said C, D, and E force, and I said let us fortuitously consider that by C, D, and E force, that although they are relative, and it all has to do with the position of the observer, the thinker that was perceiving and thinking about the situation in which forces were involved, that although that be true, then to get us started, like we're going to play with numbers, we're going to take up arithmetic before we try at all to tackle algebra. Now I guess, all right, let's consider that it would seem to be constructive force, destructive force, and then E, I'll let stand for irrelevant force. Of course, someone was kind enough to point out that in most parts of this planet they do not spell irrelevant with an E. But not only is this not a course in physics, it ain't a course in spelling. For a while I used that. I tried to do it enough to where I could tell that there was collectively enough people listening to me that began to get some grasp of it, to where I tried to abandon it, or I told you even in the beginning, I said, now it's not constructive force. And you remember some of the examples. I'll pull out one again and try to expand a little bit, because I know that some of you already feel like you have some grasp of this, which is always a mistake, because then you believe that you... Well, that's a mistake if you believe, well, you already hear a period when I bring up some subject, like, well, wait a minute, I already know about that. You have not only boxed the compass, you've cubed it, which will get you in strange positions trying to sail on that basis. The old example, the one I kept using, let us take the Northern Europeans settling the North American continent, or the Spanish and Portuguese doing so south of the border. And I pointed out that, and when I say relatively speaking, for you people getting this at some other time in some other place via tape, it's got nothing to do with situational ethics or morality. Nothing. It just sounds like it, but you got to get past that. And when I say relatively, it is not some verbal attempt to squeeze out from under any lack of an ability for me to point at something directly, because I am pointing directly, and I'm telling you that you first hear it. It's the way consciousness, the way intelligence here is constructed. It sounds like you're hearing what I say when I say, all right, now listen. The forces, what I'm calling the forces, are relative, but they're not. They seem to be relative because, and I warned you beforehand, you say, okay, I'll try. Now, so all right, let's take the example. The Northern Europeans began to, as they call it historically, settle the North American continent, and they began to do physical material damage to those people who are the indigenous people already living here, the so-called American Indians. There is an example, but remember, I'm going to tell you one more time, this is not a fact, not historically, it's not a fact that one's constructive, one's destructive. The Europeans, without me going in, you've got to remember that much history, all kinds of reasons. I'm trying to escape the tyranny of the crown in England, trying to escape the Germans and the French in the continent, Trying to escape having to eat potatoes all the time in Ireland. Trying to escape from Bulgaria where you're supposed to look like a potato. I don't know. You could say that they considered it constructive. We'll get over there, and some of them even said, we're going to a new place so that we can worship God. All right? Now, if you had been part of that movement, and somewhere in your genes, most of you, somewhere in your genes, you were on those original ships. Some of your genetic progenitors were in there. And some of them were crying out, we're going to a new land so that we can worship God and do what's right. And keep those would-be, pseudo, potentially Catholic pretenders to the British crown off our asses, or perhaps our backs. So, they came here and it was constructive. And even once they found that there were Aborigine people here, they probably said, well, wait, we'll not only help ourselves, we'll help them. We'll teach them about the great white gods. It didn't seem to work out that way. But do you realize you ought to be able to hear it? This is not a verbal attempted escape from mea culpa historically, because they saw no evil in what they were doing. But for them, they were being constructive. Now, right quick, you should be able to feel a little bit that if you were an American Indian, if you had a more direct line to that kind of genetic background, and just take it historically, theoretically, right quick, so we can press on, you would say that, hey, what they did was destructive. We're even now feeling the impact, still the impact of it. The incidence of alcoholism on the reservations among American indigenous people, the Indians, is unbelievable. The unemployment is 3 times the national average. They're still been cheated, misused. It just wrecked their whole psyche, their social structures. They would say that the settling, as we call it, they would say, as you call it, the settling of our continent, what you call the North American continent, this wilderness, by your forefathers, was destructive. We were minding our own business, everything was going fine, and now we're a bunch of out-of-work alcoholics, many of us. So they would call it destructive. The Aztecs would say the same thing. At least some of you think you're getting off the hook. More closely tied to Garcia of Leon, the Castilians and the Portuguese. Now, if we went south of the equator, down there, the Aztecs and those Mayas and everybody else would have more or less the same kind of opinion toward the Spanish and the Portuguese, you know, kind of like, that, you know, boy, that was really constructive. You know, do us some more favors like that. You know, none of us will be left. All right. Now, that sounds, I'm sure, that anybody just was seeing this tape for the first time could say, look, I got all that. They could even say, and I'd understand that, hey, you wasted 10 minutes getting up to this point. I hear all that. You don't. No, you don't. I'm going to assume that you hear enough for me to go on, but you hadn't heard the point of it. If you had, you have not yet. There is no such thing. Let us take, though, right now, just those two, the C and the D. And even you people that I was speaking of that might be seeing this for some time say, yeah, I got all that. I see what you mean. Going with a damn theory. Going with a metaphor, wherever you're going with this. That, yeah, all right, from this position, in this isolated example, the Northern Europeans coming here, settling the North American continent, to them was a constructive force. Free land. Chance to worship any way you wanted to. Go out and piss in the woods. Nobody can stop you. Just a whole new life. All right. See, constructive force. All right, I got that. But you're right. If I had been an Indian here, I would think, my God, it's a destructive force. I'd look around. Where did all these strangers come from? Running amok here, taking away our land, pushing us out of the way. That's destructive force. All right. Now let's say that you got that. But now let me tell you, you ain't got that. There's no such thing. Instead of constructive force, to take this example, and for me to speak for ordinary intelligence, I might say I got it, all right? Then you would say, in my example, constructive force would equate with the Northern European settlers, right? Okay. So instead of constructive force, let's say the North European force, right? But there is no such thing as the North European force. Now, I don't care what history says. It's not a history lesson either. But I don't care what history says, and you've got to be able to go past the verbal boundaries of any history. I'm not questioning their retelling date-wise and specific episodic-wise of what happened. But they can say, all right, the North American continent, by and large, at least south of the present Canadian border, that this was by and large settled by North European immigrants, right? They were a force. They were the force that by and large settled this. There's no such thing as a North European force. Even in my example. And you would think there is. All right, we got it settled down. Let this represent the Indians here, minding their own business, and this represent the incoming North Europeans, the settlers. There is no such thing as that. Not as a force. Now, historically, you've got to look at it as a force, or you'd never get past the first page if it said the history of the world, or the history of the Western world from 1400 on. You would never get past the first page. Like some of you, if you're listening to intelligence, might think, I'm never going to get past this. I'm going to be introducing tonight's tape for an hour and a half. That's just the kind of basis on which premises founded thinking is founded. There is no such thing as the European settler force, any more than there is any such thing as the constructive force. Now, let us again, I'm not questioning history, we're just taking history as it is accepted. There was certainly this episode in the linear life of this planet that at one time all of these Europeans, Northern Europeans primarily, moved over here and took over this continent, and it made it theirs more or less. That happened. And they've got to call that episodically, linearly, an occurrence, and they were the force that did it. But there is no such thing. There never was. There's not a European settler force. Or to look at it from the other way, that, all right, if we were talking about the Indians, they were sitting here minding their own business, and they were the force, in my example, you would think, the destructive force, or the resisting force, as far as the Europeans that didn't want them to do it. That they were the force we had to overcome. There's no such thing as that. There's no such thing as the Native American force. And this has got nothing to do with politics, racial identity, history, location. It's just simply you've got to understand that that's the kind of necessary intellectual shortcut to say that there was a North European force. Now they might not particularly use that word, they might say the dynamics of the settlement of this continent by them. But what they're saying is that this was historically, that this was in reality some sort of force that can be identified. Now it can certainly be identified, but it will not explain anything because it is limited to the three-dimensional, visible, intellectually visible world. There's no such thing as a force. It may not, I feel, seem to have made that too much clearer to some of you, but all the way from that to what I'm telling you, which is not really the point, but there is really no such thing as the force of gravity, or the law of gravity, which represents the force. There is anything that can be identified by ordinary intelligence as being a force. It's not. Now, within the confines of how it's identified, the use here, I'm not questioning that. A lot of good it would do me. Like if I said it's not there, the law of gravity is going to go away, right? But it is more complex than that. It is more enriched than that. And so it is not a force. Now I went from talking about constructive and destructive and irrelevant force, and I wasn't playing with words, and some of you by now in retrospect perhaps can sense. Then I stopped calling it any of that, even after I told you beforehand that that didn't apply. Then I just called it C, D, and E. And periodically I'd remind you that, you know, that's what I used to call constructive, destructive, and irrelevant. Now I just call it C, D, and E force. And now sometimes when I do refer to it, if you notice, I'll try and leave out force. Maybe if I'm going to do it once or twice during the night, the first time I'll say C, D, and E force. But then I try and just say, if I don't notice some of you looking strange or just flying by, I just say C, D, or E, which is even getting better. But the reason I am going back and respond to some of these inquiries is if I say C, D, and E, that sounds like gibberish. And to those of you now that may feel like at least verbally you're up to date, partially, for me to drop the force thing, I couldn't have started out not with the same intention that I had to point you in a certain direction and say, all right, I'm going to talk about C, D, and E sometimes. But what I mean is, sort of, like a constructive force, which I mean by C, and destructive force by D, E, which would be irrelevant force. So everybody remember that, okay? And everybody goes, yeah. All right, now sometimes, once you got that, everybody got that, just trust me, and everybody go, yeah. And that's all right. Then instead of going through saying constructive, destructive, and irrelevant, I just say C, D, and E force, all right? You know, I'll go, okay, we can follow that. Now say, you just think about it when I say it. You say, okay. Now say, you sure got, yeah, all right. In that case, I'm going to drop force, I just want to say C, D, and E. And then you fill in the rest. And you say, okay, we can do that. But then what I want to tell you is, all right, now remember that you got to fill in the rest. You say, okay, and now I say, but don't fill it in. At the general basis, any of you who may think that contrary to me having responded to the questions of say more about C, D, and E, that I've even muddied the waters, the basic useful pertinence of me bringing this up is not in you catching up with my little maps and the names and terms I make up, but the basic pertinence that you should try and see is me saying, which is a valid statement, that at the very foundation of what is visible, sensual reality here, which is the only reality ordinary intelligence knows, is three things going on, all right? Three forces. But remember, they're not forces. And the first thing that should strike you is that ordinary consciousness, from scientific world on up and down and sideways, does not take this into account. That all scientific reality, all social reality, all moral reality, all emotional, intellectual reality seems to require only the good old yin-yang. But it does not. That will not satisfy even a fair schematic of what's going on here if your intelligence gets just a little beyond the kindergarten stage. That it will not satisfy. Now, ordinary people it does. Even scientists, other than I will admit, it's still beginning to seep out here and there. Certain little exotic pockets, very specialized, but primarily as far as I care to mention is popping out, has popped out in physics. That things just begin to seem more and more quirky to a few people. But that's really beside the point. It has no widespread effect on human consciousness, human intelligence on this planet. But seeing only two things, two forces, will not explain anything. Now, it explains enough to comfort and soothe and to put a new coat of shoe polish on ordinary intelligence. But if you try and perceive past the gloss and the shine of even what appears to be everyday information, even scientific information, then the fact that there are always two opposing forces, two opposing dynamics, two intertangled phenomenon, the yin-yang idea, that you've got to have the hard and the soft, the male and the female, the up and the down, the right and the wrong. And that continues to pass. Every generation believes they have discovered the yin-yang. That, my God, now my intellect is beginning to perk. People you would think with just ordinary, run-of-the-mill education in the Western world forget that the Greeks, the Sumerians were talking about that 3,000 years ago. And people that life generally wires up to have pretensions of being a thinker continually rediscover that. Now, I'm not being sarcastic about it, but it is nothing new. And not only is it nothing new, it explains no more today than it did 3,000 years ago. But people continue to think, ha! There is some great metaphorical, even deeper significance in the good old yin-yang symbol. They keep rediscovering that thing over and over. Of how it's interlocked, and they continue to dance around. And first it's up and then down, and then good wins, then evil wins. No, I'm too enlightened to be religious. First truth wins, and then error takes over, and then truth wins again. But if things are wired up slightly different on this planet, differently, there would be people here and there, they do experience it, they just don't know how to enunciate it. Even after they discover that and wallow in it, I don't know, 2 or 3 minutes, to realize it is true. There is this kind of universal dance, or at least planetary dance, of all these opposing factors. And sometimes truth wins, and then error takes over, and then certainty, and then some doubt creeps in. God, I've discovered it. After 2 or 3 minutes, I think, well, shit, I'm hungry again. Which seems sort of apropos this an Oriental symbol of yin-yang, and like the old Western joke that I ate the symbol, but, that's funny. It seemed delightful and nutritional there for a couple of minutes, but damn, I'm starving again. But it explains nothing. If you try to get over the horizon, if you try to just barely get over the horizon. I'm going to try again. Some of you don't think you need it to explain or to try to point you that there is yet another force, possibility, a dancer. The yin-yang symbol is not complete. It is complete from one view, that they just don't see it. I've done this before and I'll do it again. That old idea of the, that this is one of the forces and then over there is the other one, is they only see two, even in the symbol. But there's a third, and I can describe it several ways. And it's before people, but I was going to try tonight to even point a little more specifically, neurobiologically, but symbolically, which is very close to neurobiology as most people get on this planet, that you don't have just two symbols there. You don't just have this one. Let's say that for the time being that's representing the male or the hard, the aggressive. You don't just have one, and then over here you got the other one that fits in, two. There's several ways, two primary ways I can point out. What is missing, what they don't see, is there's also a third figure here, which is those two together, makes the circle itself. There's also another. To draw it required that piece of paper. I had to draw that symbol on something. And you would have never, nobody on this planet would have ever seen this symbol somewhere in your head. You saw it in a book. You saw me draw it. Whoever put it in a book saw it in another book. Somebody somewhere, the first time, it may have been drawn in the sand. And if you got to have one more place to start, the sand would have been the third force, would have been the third partner in the dance. It is the eternal background. But quite materially, I've never put it to you in this manner, but some of you now, it might at least give you a small helping of new intellectual birdseed. There is a reason, as always, but there is a specific, it is non-mystical, it's got nothing to do with symbols, it got nothing to do with the Orient versus the West, it got nothing to do with Aztecs versus conquistadors, it's got nothing to do with some kind of curse that man cannot see this great third dancer, this third possibility going on. It goes like this. In the sensual world in which we live, it's called three-dimensional. What, and I'm pointing out that instead of forces, let's call this a representation, my C, D, and E, of the three-dimensional world. And the reason I point out to you, I point out that people do not see, cannot think about there being an E force. It's this, the E force is intelligence. It is that which perceives the other two. That's it. Now that's it biologically. That I can say that ordinary intelligence is incapable of thinking about, of seeing, under any kind of natural conditions, of seeing that everything going on is not yin-yang. Everything is not 1-2. Everything is not two conflicting, dancing, wrestling. even agreeable forces, that there are three. Assuming I'm telling you something quite valid and useful. The reason is not because of stupidity, the reason not because of some kind of strange exotic curse or malfunction. It's this, that one of the three is that which the other two pieces of information are being drawn on. That one of the three is human intelligence. It is the reality of you as a thinking creature. If this had some kind of intelligence, that piece of paper, you do understand, just right quick, that I could draw these two, or write C and D, and say that's the two forces that run everything. It's okay, yeah, I know that. And if I said there's another one though, because what you just agreed to is incorrect, it's incomplete, there's a third one. And this thing said, tell me. And I said, the third one is this. And it'd go, where? Literally. That is literally, as far as literally is literal in the three-dimensional world, of that being pointed out to the ordinary workings of the brain, to say, all right, you see always two things, and only two. And you don't feel shortchanged. It seems adequate, just as any question. All right, things that have any morality about them, you're listening to me? And the brain's, yeah. All right, they're either right or wrong. If they have morality, it doesn't matter. I mean, that's not it's not in part of this discussion. Okay. But if they do have morality, it's either right or wrong. You say, yeah. If we're talking about facts, then facts are statements. Not statements of feeling, not expression of feeling verbally, but statements are either true or false, right? And this thing goes, yeah. Then if you tell it, no, wait a minute. There's a third possibility to all that and any other example you come up with. It's all right, show it to me. That's right, the third example, the third possibility is right there. And it goes where? There. It is biologically, materially, physically, not to say it any plainer, it is impossible under ordinary conditions for the nervous system to see this third. Because it is operating in this world as the third. It is that which is perceiving the other two. No matter what the other two seem to be exemplary-wise, or even if it can swap back and forth. Up here, if it can jump from the American Indian side, and then jump over to the North European settlers, and then reverse it, and say, well, theoretically, I can see that from a certain view, one group would first call the other group what they're doing constructive, what they're doing destructive, and I can reverse it. I'm intelligent, I can see both sides. But there's a third one. Where? It is, in this case, quite literally, that which is perceiving the other two is the third one. Now I have described this, amongst other ways, the E, the third one, being irrelevant. That is the view that ordinary intelligence would have under any example, if I said. Because it can follow this much, it just makes no sense. It shows no purpose. If I said, all right, to choose my example, and this thing, ordinary, good, full-running intelligence, and a good, full-running, educated, sophisticated person on this planet, on this three-dimensional planet Earth. That's all right, take my example. It's all relative, and everything we're describing is ad hoc. According to this situation, it goes, all right, I can understand all that. I'm a theoretical physicist, all right? We can see what I'm calling two forces. And it says, yeah, I know you're C and D. All right, I say, all right, let's take the Indian position. That they're fighting for their homeland, for their way of life, to them was constructive. That was an example of C force. And he says, got you. All right, and in this example, the whole scenario of the North Europeans coming here and settling the continent, as they call it, from their view, that was the D force. And it says, got that, got it. And I say, all right, now, what is the E force in this? And it says, well, I don't know. You've talked around in circles. I do not know, because as far as I can see, you've covered it all. And I say, all right, using my example, the settling of the North American continent, we got the C and the D force. The E force is everything else. And it might say, everything? And I might say, what are you, fucking deaf? I said everything. It is everything that appears to be irrelevant to the quite obvious, quite plain two forces that any good intelligence can always see. Now, even me pushing, I guess, the limits of linear intelligence, still for a brief moment, a person can hear what I said. If they wanted me to expand on it, I might say, look, when I mean irrelevant, I mean everything. All right, what was going on in Madagascar during that whole period? As far as we know, historically, I can't, not being a historian, but I don't remember any pertinence. I don't remember any native Mascagarians. I don't remember any part that fine, splendid island and the people of Madagascar played on the settling of the North American continent. And the intelligence to whom I was having this illustrious, although silly conversation might say, all right, I agree to that. That's all right. There is an example of I don't want to say it, force. All right, it can hear that. But what kind of nonsense is that? The only response that ordinary intelligence has is, all right, I hear you, and so what? You are right. Even though you misspelled it to call it irrelevant, because it is irrelevant to this. Need I go a lot farther? I can keep going, but if you don't begin to catch a glimpse of this, me keep going, I can pile example upon example. I can say, all right, Madagascar did have some pertinence, because picture this. Picture this. If Madagascar had sunk, if there'd been that kind of volcanic, underwater, subterranean upheavals, instead of it being volcanic action and producing new, let's say it was the other way, seismographic kinds of activities, and it's swallowed up. Madagascar may be, it's for the size of it, if it completely disappeared, it would probably raise the sea level all across the country, the world. It's a fair-sized island. But anyway, follow me. Do I have to go much further and try to drag this into a geological area and to point out to you that quite literally it could have affected the North Europeans, the kind of boats that they were building, ships at that time, the whole thing could have directly affected the so-called settling of this continent at the time it happened. If you won't buy Madagascar, how about Australia? How about Australia and Madagascar? All right. Again, if you don't begin to get a glimpse of this, I can make up even more examples. I can turn it into sociological examples, religious examples. The things that just seem, without any doubt, to be impertinent to what we're talking about, could be seen as being pertinent to what was going on in Madagascar, in Russia, in China, had an effect on what was going on in the settling of the North American continent. And I could make ordinary intelligence go, all right. And it's still, just as soon as it says all right, all you got to do is check yourself. We're not talking about some other fictitious person. You check the way your own nervous system works, it goes, so what? And it's so what almost on the basis of a kind of neurological inability to make a fist. You can't hold on to it. I can point it out, and verbally it makes some reason. All right, yeah. And you can't hold on to it. It is almost, it's not a bad example, the brain attempting to turn and hold on to itself. It'd be an attempt for me to talk to this paper, and I say, all right, you got these two, and it says, yeah, and I say, all right, you would see a lot more. There's a whole other reality, because there's a third thing to this yin-yang idea. And it says, what? And I said, it's this. It would be like this thing trying to go, and it says, where? And I said, really, right there. It'd be like it trying to pull itself together and to begin to see itself. That in some way it could pull up like this, and if it had an eye in here, or a bunch of eyes, and fold up and begin to see itself and go, ah! Like the brain being able to, in some way, literally fold up and grab itself and go, ah! The part that was missing. That's what you were talking about. That's the part that holds the two I can see, yeah? But now I see, you're right, there's a third part. And it's me. We've got to turn the tape over. I think I'm going to leave the general area again tonight, except to stress to you one more time that there is not a theoretical, not a philosophical basis for my C, D, and E divisions. Even though I start out and admitted I made it up. It's not necessary to think this way. It's not necessary to see. If you never see, if you could never think you see, what I mean by E, nothing bad will happen. You'll live out your days. You'll still live probably as long as Allstate says you'll live at their table. But by me saying it then, and at times I know the way, because of the premise that speech on this planet requires, it sounds as though at times I am preaching or hectoring or threatening, which I'm not, to say that you need to see this. When you ordinarily take that as being a kind of at least tacit premise, which ordinary intelligence would, that everything either is threatening or offering promise of a reward, then it's it's almost predictable if you actually believe or suspect that there is some sort of information that that person or that source is hinting at, that may know or has access to, that I don't see, then it's almost a wired-in certainty that people accept the fact that, all right, the gods or forces in some way have cursed me, our whole tribe, humanity as a whole, or perhaps there is genetically or psychologically some kind of stress trauma on me that makes it impossible for me to see it, and it goes on and on and on. And it's none of that. And it's not that I have some access to some secret book on this planet and that I got this information out, and boy, it's secret, and I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to beat you over the head, I'm going to keep saying, you've got to see it, there's another one here. It's none of that. There is a biological, neurological, material basis for the reason that ordinary intelligence, sometimes called consciousness, but ordinary intelligence cannot see more than two forces, two anythings required for there to be phenomenon that is touchable, smellable, experienceable, thinkable. Because the third one, it's not limited to this, but the third one is that which is perceiving the other two. Intelligence is the third one. There is another planet that I wanted to mention. They have a thinking about this general area I'm talking about, not dissimilar to what I'm describing to you. But there is a certain variation I always wanted to talk about, and now I'm just going ahead and tell you that it does already exist, because it has some pertinence. I'm going ahead and use my terms. I don't mean that's what they call it, but C, D, and E. And everybody remember what I was saying, that from ad hoc, from isolated, artificial examples such as the settlement of the North American continent, the Catholic Church's use of the Inquisition, anything in history, anything in your history, that apparently there was some good stuff going on, something constructive, something, and then there seemed to be something destructive, opposing it. And then there's whatever I mean by the E, that which seemed to be vis-a-vis any example, seemed to be irrelevant. C, D, and E, all right? Okay. On this particular planet, they have an expansion of this. And I'm again translating other terms and ideas that are foreign, but there's just enough of it that's pertinent here for me to go ahead and do it. And so I'm going to use our kind of terms. But they see it this way. You follow me? Take what I'm describing, and it's a piece of reality somewhere else. But they have an addition to it, insofar as it applies to what I've described. It goes like this, that they see, they don't use these terms necessarily, but they see what I'm calling, they see D is equaling the past, and C equaling the present, and what I call E equaling the future, which they really don't even have a word like that. It's really alternative possibilities. is what the future is. Think about that for a moment. Because I've already said that there is, for a few people, not on any kind of widespread basis, but there is usable pertinence. On this same planet, as long as I've stuck my foot in it, if you're following what I'm saying of me putting my own terms that just quite easy in words, they even have an additional way that they think about it, this general area. Does all my drawings still pick up? Are they large enough? This really gets, some of you may find this really good. If you do, then I'll just do it and we'll move on. Even if you don't, I guess I'll just do it and move on. In the three-dimensional world, on planet Earth, it is sensual reality to describe our environment, us, as three-dimensional creatures, three-dimensional life. The nice, easy way, everything that exists has height. And even on two-dimensional paper, I can draw what everybody's familiar with, a symbolic representation that goes beyond the limits of this piece of paper. Everything has height. Everything has width, the second dimension. Everything has depth, the third dimension. Then, it is sort of agreed here, it's now becoming sort of a part of the general wiring intelligence of humanity that there is a fourth dimension. It started out in physics, theoretical physics, but now they say that there is, in a sense, a fourth dimension, which of course is time. And it can be plotted out on graph paper. They can be worked into theoretical equations. But even ordinary people, just hanging around a bar, if you caught their attention for a few minutes, you can say that, they're not just three dimensions of height, depth, and width. You don't have to be Einstein to understand there's really a fourth dimension. Because three-dimensional objects, if they're alive, or even if they're not alive, if you perceive them, you're alive to perceive them, and they exist not only in these three physical, spatial dimensions, they also exist in time. Because to really identify, to locate a person, a system, an idea, you have got to take into account time. You can't say that it just exists in Birmingham. You can say that, but that's not very good information. Because you could run over to see it and come back and say it's not there. And I say, oh, it burned down 10 years ago. But you asked me where it was located, and I told you Birmingham. Or where are the burnt valves, where are they going to have their next show? And I say in Birmingham. And you rush over to see the show, and you come back, and I say, well, it's not going to be until December. So people can see, not just theoretically, but people can think and see time. See, I've drawn as much as you can do on paper. In fact, I've done as much if we had this off paper and I was actually holding up a three-dimensional object that's got three dimensions, got height, width, and breadth. Now I'm holding it here, but we can't hold up time. I can't produce time. I can't draw time. I can't even draw another dimension no matter what I called it. I played with your eyes as much as we can. It's a kind of trompe-l'oeil to draw that kind of figure, but you know what it represents right there. It represents something with actual three dimensions. And if we say, all right, there's a fourth one, time, we all go, yeah, then I can't draw it. Now wait, on this other planet, they have a, that wasn't the end of a sentence. They also have a kind of similarity, not using these words, of thinking of time in the three ways that we do. This is not generally how people think, but this is not weird. You know that I can say, well, time has three dimensions as far as it seems to be a living reality on this planet. But instead of drawing it like that way, I used to draw that line and I'd say, you know, let this represent the past over here, and let that represent the future, and then wherever you are right now is like the present. So if you ask people about time, how many dimensions does it have? We don't use those terms, but if they say, oh, I know what you mean, you're right. Well, there are three distinct. I mean, nobody questions it, nor should they. I'm not questioning it. On this planet, if you say time has three dimensions, space and spatial objects not only have three dimensions of height, breadth, and width, time has three dimensions. And everybody, as soon as they know what I'm talking about, will say, yeah. Well, nobody with general wired up intelligence will say, no, time doesn't have three dimensions, it only has two. It only has the past and the present. No, nobody's going to say it. Nobody's going to say it doesn't have three, it only has one. It only has the past. If you try to just think about how reality seems, all the way from the opinions and theories of physics, all the way to just what has got to be wired up, human sense, time has three dimensions. The past, the present, and the future. Now on this other planet, in the same way that I'm saying here, that everybody now is wired up to hear this kind of reality that you can draw or even construct, hold up a box or that roll of duct tape and say that every spatial object, every object, person that exists has three spatial dimensions, but then it has a fourth one that goes off that you can't draw, you can't produce it, but it's time and it's necessary. It's there, or things wouldn't exist. On this other planet, they got three dimensions of time that's not dissimilar, I'm just using our terms, for the past, present, and the future, but then there's something else. They have a fourth dimension to time that after you have, not incorrectly, thought of, perceived time as you should here, is having three dimensions. I could say that that's past, present, and future. It goes off in a corner, it turns a corner, it goes around another dimension, and time has a fourth dimension. Now I ask you, I am going to leave it, I ask you, if that had any pertinence here, what possibility would be another dimension besides past, present, and future to time? I'm going to pick up a couple of continuations and expositions from the last time we were taping. Remember I was telling you about that place that was studying the creatures that had this kind of herd song and the time that the creatures had to spend, my first observation, of trying to learn the ever-increasing, almost daily increasing complexity and additions to this song, and how they then began to realize that the mistakes and the attempts to learn of the song was becoming part of the song itself. And other questions I arose, and other ways in which I tried to point that went between cracks of not space, at least time. And I already hit on this just as I was wrapping up some of it, of just not just hinting but pointing out to you that had quite real validity here. But that which is accepted, normally referred to as mistakes, even on this planet, are not simply mistakes that are discarded. Even if from ordinary three-dimensional, that is seeing two possibilities, three-dimensional intelligence of seeing that if a group of people or one person was trying to do something, not dissimilar to this herd, all the members trying to learn the ever-increasing herd song without realizing that in some way they were adding to it. Then at this level, people attempting to do something, to learn something, continually make what seems to be, and it's not an error, but what seems to be by all appearances, mistakes. That yes, now I understand the general purpose of quadratic equations. And they try to explain it to you, and they do not. Or I can tell you exactly the dynamics involved, the psychological dynamics involved in the kind of struggles that went on between the Native American Indians and those North American settlers, those North European settlers. And they cannot. Not because I say that there was no such thing as a force of North European settlers, but even if they made some statement that sounded as though it wrapped it up, and we brought in historians, they'd say that's not true. You left out something, you added too much, your view is too skewed, that kind of view has been revised now, that is no longer a historical accuracy. So, no matter what anybody says, it is almost a certainty that they are in part going to be mistaken as you are attempting to learn. It is not seen on this planet that that which is called mistakes becomes a part, I'm talking about thinking now, what would seem to be the intellectual storehouse of this planet. What would seem to be, if you can begin to grasp it, that there is an intellectual atmosphere. There is almost a cloud of the combined thinking energy of humanity that's on this planet. That kind of storehouse, there's no such thing as a mistake. There are things that are thought that die the same way that cells die. But it's not a mistake. Because if it dies, at least for an instant, it was part of this cloud. It was a part of the superstructure of intelligence of humanity. But much of it does not die. It dies and it's reborn under other ways in the same way it happens in you physically. Mistakes, as they are called, become part of the correct storehouse and perception of reality. Not only is that unaccountable, not only does that absolutely bypass three-dimensional intelligence, but there is a further quirk to that. That which appears to be doubtful or ambiguous, or a part of that is ambiguous, instead of mistakes, what people would think of as being doubtful in their thinking, uncertainty, or that they believe the information that they're trying to assimilate is and of itself ambiguous. It is not so. Because when they think that something is doubtful, it's like, well, I am not yet ready to put my hands on that. I thought that, or perhaps you read it, but I thought that, but I'm not sure that's true. I am not ready to even to myself say that's true. Or you read something or you think something and you say, all right, that is true. I can see that we did mistreat our forefathers. We did mistreat the native people here. I don't know. There are ways I can see it, though. As much damage as I'm sure we did, they're actually better off. No matter what complaints they have now, they're better off than they would have been. There is, I don't know, there's a kind of ambiguity to that idea. I'm not ready. I can't decide. Maybe I don't have enough info yet. What I'm trying to get you to see is something that would appear to be this side of a mistake. That I don't want to make a mistake in my thinking. I don't want to decide that something is correct and then find out it's not, because right now I am still uncertain. There's a certain amount of ambiguity in my own thinking, so I don't want to make a mistake. So therefore I'm not going to add. If there is a storehouse and reservoir of information, there must be an anti-reservoir, that is, of ignorance, and I don't want to add to it. So I'm not going to decide yet what I think, because I'm not sure. That is part of the storehouse. But it is not taken into consideration, and it has quite specific pertinence, material reality in the transformation, the transfer of energy in that. Believe it or not, since I've been talking in this way, let me give you a truly irrational example. In the ultimate, that is, the more enriched, something beyond the three-dimensional limits of earth consciousness, for that kind of more complex transfer of energy, information, thinking, there has to be a kind of looseness. Things cannot be too locked tight. Now, some of you may think I've said this before, but I was going to give you a really rational, three-dimensional example. When it comes to actual, and you may be mistaken thinking that this has already been disproven, because it hasn't. But when it comes to truly interplanetary travel, there has got to be a tolerance in the navigation. What could be more irrational than that? And I'm saying that's valid. Because if you were going to go from here and your life was on the line, you would think, and you're trying to go just from here to the moon, much less Jupiter and Nectarine. Okay, Neptune. You would think, listen, I'm not getting on, you know, if NASA or whoever's running it now, J.C. Penney, and they're saying, and somebody says, hey, we found out to correctly do this, there has to be a kind of, you know, a little, shall we say, somewhat of a kind of navigational laissez-faire that, you know, we're going. There's got to be a kind of looseness in it, man, huh? You know, most people wouldn't want to get on that spaceship. That if we're going to travel from one spot millions or billions of miles away, we got to talk about all kinds of taking into. Got to know a lot more about geometry, trigonometry, and other areas than I care to even think about, that you got to know specifically, and the movements of the heavens, that you got to know, you know, what direction they're going and how to make the kinds of continual adjustments to specifically get there spatially and time-wise at the right spot to land on that mother. Don't tell me that there's a kind of, you know, looseness and tolerance in this. I'm going to repeat for you. In real interplanetary travel, there has, between planets, whether you think I'm talking about out there or somewhere else, there has got to be a tolerance in the navigational systems, the navigational plans, the thinking itself. It cannot be too strict. That is absolutely irrational. For those that are satisfied with no more than three-dimensional intelligence, it's not only irrational, it's just silly, it's meaningless, but it's a fact. And it is not unrelated, might I add, to what else I brought up tonight, of there being on another spot in the universe, there be places where not only do they see and think about D as being the past and C the present and E alternative possibilities, the future, but they see time as not only being past, present, and future, but having another dimension, not unlike us taking time as being the fourth dimension of space. They have a fourth dimension of time. It is not unrelated. And of course, to you people that may be getting spooked out there on tape, this has got really nothing to do with going outside and trying to jump high enough to break the bonds of Earth's gravity and fly to another planet. But rather than, as I warned a few meetings back, rather than continue to talk about what would seem to be possibilities here, as I would prefer now, some of you can hear it, to tell you the way things are in some other parts of the universe. It's already there, but which is another subject about coeval causality. But it is already happening, and it may not be simply on another spatial planet. It can be on another time planet. If you care to try and pursue the question I left with you, what pertinence might it have here of there being not only a fourth dimension to space, being time, which seems to be a whole nother dimension, right? It's not, when we say time is the fourth dimension here, it's like you go through three dimensions, height, width, and breadth. All right, everybody got that. All right, and the fourth one's time. You understand, time is not really the same family. It's like saying instead of 3 brothers in this family, we actually have 4 brothers, and you people didn't know it. For years and years and years, up until the 20th century, we thought that the universe was made up of 3 brothers, height, width, and breadth. But it's not. it also has got a fourth brother, time. Except the point, if you line them up, it'd be like three short, red-headed, green people was height, breadth, and width. And you say, now, what really holds reality together, we just didn't realize it now, is the fourth brother. And he comes in, and the fourth brother is 7 feet tall, purple, and a girl. A girl hippo, maybe. That's not even close. You bring in the fourth one, and it's a redwood tree. How about that? Or it's a boulder. It's a burned out 49 Studebaker. You understand? It's of a different species. To say that spatially, we're talking about the three brothers, the three dimensions are time, or height, width, and breadth, yeah. And the fourth one is, there ain't no fourth one in that family. The fourth one is time. You've been used to hearing it now. You go, yeah, but you understand you have shifted, to say the least, gears. You have gone not in another direction, because time is not a spatial direction. You just changed the whole affair. Now think. Do your best. What could possibly be anywhere comparable to say, all right, now time has got three dimensions, now that you mention it. It does. There's no doubt about it. You got to have three or you're not even talking about time. It has the past, which we know exists. I have a past. Forget history. Forget whether they have records past 3,000 years ago in the Western world. I know that there is a past dimension of time because I've lived through it. I had a past yesterday. And I know there's right now. I know it right now is different from this afternoon at 5 o'clock when I was stuck in traffic. I know that if we're going to have to narrow it down, and I know there's a future because every day, every moment I live, there's something that's coming up. There is a future. All right. So you got those three brothers, the three things that they're all related, the past, the present, and the future. That's all time. Now if there's a fourth one, it's another species. You're going to bring in a boulder and try to pass it off as the fourth brother to these three short purple guys with green hair. It's going to be something. It's not just, all right, time goes da, da, da. All right, and the fourth one would be, it's not that. In the same way that you go through the three dimensions of space and say, all right, we got 4 dimensions here, but the fourth one is, all right, up, and that way. And then you can't point your finger, you can't draw, you can't even picture time as being an extension of space. So imagine if there is a fourth one, which there is, and it's seen in other places, but if that had impertinence here, where have you got to go? It is not some kind of logical, it's not even illogical, but it's certainly no kind of linear progression of, all right, past, present, future, and boom. It goes, whatever it would be, do, and then somewhere else. What I was saying was that was not unrelated to me telling you that the correct passage of energy, of information, and I'll go ahead and say it. Let me keep saying interplanetary travel, which is true, but interplanetary in your own nervous system, to try and get information, even if you apparently picked it up first out here. There's no consequence. It gets in the nervous system and you're trying to use it. And you've got to move it, or it'll never get used. To move it, it cannot be too strict. You cannot have some kind of navigational charts, which is part of what education plays on this planet. Not that it's wrong, but it's to tell you that there is specific ways if you're going to learn something, such as multiplication tables, you used to at least, and it still would be valid. What's the way to do it? As you sit yourself down and you go, 2 and 2 is 4. 4 and 4, then down. And you've learned it. That 2 and 2 is not open to some kind of interpretation. You don't say, well, 2 and 2 is 4 sometimes. On Tuesdays it's not. Or if you live in Birmingham, it's not. That is what education, that is what the mechanical development of the human nervous system up through the brain, through the intellect is on planet Earth, is it is strict. That true is true and false is false. If you're going to move from one place to another, true interplanetary travel, which doesn't exist just out there, there has to be a tolerance in the navigation itself, in the movement of the vehicle. If the vehicle is energy, whether it's your intelligence, there has got to be a lack of it being too strict, which is absolutely, and irrational doesn't cover it. It's just wrong on this planet. Because you can't learn anything, including the multiplication tables. You'd never even gotten into high school, much less college. If you'd say, well, yeah, we studied the multiplication tables when I was in school, but as a matter of fact, I'm a little more intelligent. I'm going to have to tell you people. Maybe it's going to stand up while taking the college boards and say, by the way, I'm going to have to tell you. I know the answers you want of me wanting to know if 2 and 2 is 4. I know that it seems to be, but it's not necessarily true. You understand? That is foolishness. That doesn't even cover it. It's just wrong. But if you're ever going to travel anywhere else, it's not wrong, it's not right, it's just too strict. It has no tolerance. And it is not unrelated to there being in another place a recognized, and they think about it, they take into consideration a fourth dimension to time. I'm not trying to be all that vague. It has also a connection to what they see as the E-pool, the background upon which I wrote this, the background upon which you think about the other two, of this thing about C and D, of the future, trying to think about the past and the present. If it could turn on itself, I'm telling you, it is not unrelated to this. That if there is a tolerance somewhere, if there is what I'm telling you is a necessary tolerance to move information, to move you, it's not unrelated to this, it's not unrelated to, in another place, there being a fourth dimension to time. Another quick catch-up, something I was mentioning. Remember last time of Medivesco and its evil twin brother, its sister planet. I decided to pronounce it Oog or Og. Ugsivitum, Medivesco backwards. And I'm pointing out that there is a reality, two things that's happening in the world, and they can be seen ex post facto when somebody points it out, that some things seem to get better when you just give them attention. Yeah, isn't that weird? You kick the TV and it comes on. You worry about how's your sister doing, and you call up and it turns out that just you calling her, she said she felt terrible, and then a few days later you get a card and she says how much better she felt just hearing from you. And it's not really that weird, and you think, yeah, that kind of thing happens to me. Not only that, but then I showed you that there is in a less specific manner even the medical idea of iatrogenic, of the treatment of somebody being worsened by the physician, the treator's continued treatment. But I point out that there is something quite more widespread than that medically, that there are things that are worsened, people that are worsened, ideas that are worsened, things that are worsened through the continued attention. Now all this happens mechanically. But I did want to specify, those of you that didn't pick it up on your own, that just because something happens automatically in the world and is not recognized as any sort of usable phenomenon, and is always recognized, if at all, after the fact, and then it's always, yeah, that's weird. Just because that's true does not mean that you cannot use it. To wit, just because I point out that, hey, mechanic, a lot of people, a lot of times feel better just after making an appointment with a doctor. Some of them have to go to the doctor, and the doctor, poke them and push them and charge them a lot of money and say nothing's wrong with it, I can find. They go, well, that's weird, I do feel better anyway. Well, I'll see you next year, next time I get depressed and feeling bad. And then I even point out some people, if you point out, have felt better just making a doctor's appointment. And it gets close to the day before, at least within the 48 hours, I think, so that they won't have to be charged, they suddenly decide my symptoms have cleared up. How weird. Just because that happens does not mean that you cannot use it. Just because I point out that this happens to quite ordinary people does not mean that once you know it, that in some way you shouldn't use it. I'm not saying it's all that you could do, but even if you hear that, and if you find yourself sick, I'm going to take the most ready blatant example, and you realize that, yeah, that's happened to me about the doctor's appointment and me feeling better. All right, if you find something that you seem to be kind of nebulously sick, no great symptoms, and you think about what I'm talking about Medivesco and its sister planet, and if you can't seem to really do anything else about it, don't just say, well, wait a minute, now that he pointed that out, at least I'm smart enough now, I'm more intelligent, I'm not going in there and call the doctor and make an appointment knowing that it might make me feel better and the symptoms clear up or the vague symptoms go away. Boy, that'd be dumb. If you have no other immediate alternative, and you've heard, and the night I said it, and tonight, and you kind of laughed, and you fell back in the arms of good old world intelligence, it was really sort of a sarcastic laugh, like, ha ha, well, now that you point out, I'm too smart to fall for that. Don't be an idiot doubly indemnified. Don't compound your felonious thought processes. If you can use that, there is a difference between knowingly use something that may be mechanically happening in life and that which happens that I can point out after the fact to people and make them laugh and go, yeah, you're right. How dumb. If you knowingly use it, it ain't how dumb. It's use it. And this is true in many, 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 many cases that sometimes I do not back up. Well, it's true in all cases if you can follow what I'm saying. Just because I can verbally describe something and you begin to see that, yeah, you describe something that happens that either people do not realize it, either they misname it, or they can only realize it once it's pointed out and then they forget about it, and it seems to be quirky or it seems to be simply a matter of irony. If it works and you understand it, there is a difference in then using it. And it's not some theological difference, it's not some philosophical difference, it's not some difference that pleases me. But certainly, do not discount it just because you think, well, wait, now that you point out a certain way and I had a good kind of, at least sardonic laugh on the matter. It's like then, and many people, well, it never crossed my mind. I could not stoop so low as to use that. There's a difference between just a verbal description of something and then knowing the difference in its usage and the description. Because just to know that something may be in existence, just because there may be some phenomenon such as the reality behind Medivesco that I can point out and to say that it happens, and it happens far beyond the plotting, even the notice of mankind's intelligence. There's a difference between knowing that and a difference in being able to use that. And there is no reason for you to ever let the former interfere with the latter by thinking in some way, well, that's too common. Or I've done it myself before and didn't know it, and therefore it's unworthy of my attention. I'm glad now I'm so smart I wouldn't fall for that. You're not so smart to fall for that if you still think that. That if you still think that way, then you should use it when the occasion arises. If you ever get any better than that, you'll know it. You'll know what to do. But do not ever fail to avail yourself of whatever you can do. How much time we got?